We've talked before about shock troops and shock troop tactics, and even done specials on the German stormtroops and the Italian Arditi, but they weren't the only warring nations with units like these. Austria-Hungary had its Jagdkommandos. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about Austro-Hungarian Jagdkommandos and the First World War. Actually, they had their origin well before the war. The concept behind them was Russian. Russia established hunting commandos by decree of the Tsar in 1886. That year, the Russian Army Field Manual included instructions for creating scouting units of 4 men per infantry company, artillery battery, or cavalry squadron. These men were to be brave, resolute, and self-reliant, and their name, translated as hunting commandos, came from their training program, which involved hunting predators. They were developed to prevent enemy ambushes, as the increased firepower and accuracy of weapons in the late 19th century made ambushes a costly affair. This unit development was soon also taking place in Austria-Hungary to combat guerrilla warfare in Dalmatia in the late 1880s, and these units were primarily for scouting and patrolling. Austrian historian Christian Ortner writes that the Austrian army increasingly developed the Jagdkommandos as a response to the Russians, since Russia seemed the most likely enemy in a major war. However, there were no central army directives for Jagdkommandos, no specialized training, and no overall place in army doctrine. In fact, official Austrian army doctrine had not changed since the 1860s. Emphasis was on infantry, and there was, for example, no coordination with cavalry and artillery. Training emphasized marksmanship and physical fitness, and the infantry was supposed to win on the field by means of all-out vigorous attacks. Willpower and courage were enough to overcome things like artillery or machine guns. Austrian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf was convinced of this idea, and he was not alone. The French also subscribed to it. This resulted in devastating losses for both nations in the early stages of the war, when infantry attacked modern weaponry and expected to win by willpower alone. Jagdkommandos did not play any significant role in these early months of the war. But once it descended into trench warfare, cavalry was often no good for scouting, and large-scale maneuvers could be suicidal. So Austrian Jagdkommandos were increasingly trained to overcome battlefield obstacles like barbed wire, and to use explosives like hand grenades, but they were still deployed as scouts, not assault troops. Soon though, the Austrian Fifth Army under Svetozar Boroyevich von Bojna created a special training ground where sapper and pioneer units trained new tactics and skills for trench warfare. High command was impressed, and soon all Austrian army commands had training grounds on Boroyevich's model. These laid the groundwork for the Austrian shock troops, and in the winter of 1916, officers and men were sent to learn German stormtroop tactics, and an offensive doctrine began developing. There were obstacles, however, to developing stormtroops at battalion-sized levels. This was all happening just after Russia's Brusilov offensive, which had severely hurt the Austrian army to the point where it teetered on the brink of collapse. There was an overall shortage of equipment, especially machine guns and steel helmets. The results over the winter were disappointing. However, by May 1917, Boroyevich had 1 storm battalion for training and 7,700 other men trained in close combat tactics. During the 10th Battle of the Isonzo River that month, Austrian stormtroops conducted local counterattacks for the first time against the Italians, and they made a great success, taking all objectives with minimal losses. After this battle, the units were expanded and equipped with mortars and flamethrowers. In some cases, though, the army had to strip the frontline defenses of equipment to give it to the stormtroops. This was no longer a problem a few months later, though, after the capture of enormous stockpiles of Italian equipment during and after the Battle of Caporetto. That battle was, in many ways, the high water mark for the Jagdkommando, being the first large-scale Central Powers attack in which they played a central role. It was also a huge success, and after that battle, it was the Italian army that was now on the brink of collapse. Then, the Austrian stormtroops were refitted for a summer offensive in 1918, to be launched simultaneously with German summer offensives on the Western Front. On June 15th, the Jagdkommandos attacked the Italian defensive lines on the Piave River, but this time failed failed to break through. The Italians had learned from defeat and had organized into a defense-in-depth system in 3 zones. This was unanticipated by the Austrians, and though their stormtroops captured the forward Italian trenches, they took heavy casualties when they reached the second zone, which was made up of strongholds instead of linear defenses. This failure tarnished the reputation of the Jagdkommandos, and they really disappeared from the public consciousness once the war was lost and their empire dissolved. The concept did live on in Austrian military tradition, though, after the Second World War, when the army chose the name for its special forces in 1962. Despite everything that happened in terms of the military leading up to the First World War, stormtroop tactics and true stormtroops were something that were, in fact, born from the war. Much like their counterparts in other armies, the Austrian Jagdkommandos were one of the first such specialized units, trained in infiltration and assault tactics, and 100 years ago, you could point to them as they went into action and really say, "This is modern war." We'd like to thank Rudolf Bruns for the research on this episode. If you want to learn more about the German stormtroop doctrine and development, you can click right here for our special about that. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter if you want to get more interesting World War I fun facts from Flo, our social media guy. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.